Genealogy had always been more than just a casual hobby for me. It was an anchor, a way of grounding myself in a world that felt entirely too fragile. I wasn't interested in mailing a plastic tube of saliva to a commercial laboratory and waiting 6 weeks for a sanitized pie chart of my ethnic origins. My devotion lay in the authentic, tactile pursuit of history, the kind that leaves your fingertips coated in dust from unspooling microfilm reels in the damp, quiet basements of municipal libraries. When my mother passed away unexpectedly when I was 15, tracing the sprawling architecture of her family tree became my desperate mechanism for keeping her memory alive, a methodical attempt to prove that she had truly existed and mattered. I would spend hours tracing her lineage back through generations of hard-working Polish immigrants and stoic Pennsylvania coal miners, and for a fleeting afternoon, I could convince myself that she was still woven securely into the vast, unbreakable tapestry of human history. My father's side of the family, however, presented an entirely different challenge, resembling a fortress surrounded by impenetrable walls of silence. Whenever I pressed him for details about his parents or grandparents, he would wave his hand with a dismissive, practiced humility, insisting with a soft voice that we were just plain people, and that there was absolutely nothing in our past worth digging up. I had always assumed his reluctance stemmed from a deep-seated embarrassment, perhaps a history of grinding poverty, a minor legal scandal, or an illegitimate birth, and out of respect for his privacy, I eventually stopped asking questions. That was until a few weeks ago, when a premium genealogy database I subscribed to proudly announce the upload of a newly digitized batch of Historical Society photographs sourced from rural Ohio. Knowing that my father had grown up in a small, isolated farming community just outside of Zanesville, I typed our shared surname into the search bar, expecting nothing more than a blank screen or a misdirected census form. The search engine returned exactly 2 results, both of them high-resolution scans of antique photographs. The first image was a sepia-toned group portrait taken in front of a wooden general store, the bottom corner marked with the year 1887 in fading ink. A dozen men dressed in dusty wool coats and stiff bowler hats stood squinting against the harsh sunlight of the era, and I was just about to click away when my eyes caught on a figure standing near the back row. It was my father. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed through my quiet apartment, completely convinced I was looking at a historical doppelganger. One of those bizarre genetic anomalies where a great-great-granduncle perfectly mirrors a living descendant. However, as I digitally zoomed in to examine the fine details, the rigid set of his jaw, the spacing of his eyes, and the distinct, slightly crooked angle of his left earlobe, the resemblance shifted from amusing to profoundly uncanny. Even his posture was identical to the way my father stood in my own living room. His weight shifted lazily to his right hip, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, and his face bearing a faint, patient smile that never managed to reach his eyes. I downloaded the antique image and immediately sent it to my father with a light-hearted text message, joking that I had finally located his twin from 1887. He didn't reply, which wasn't inherently suspicious given his notorious slowness with modern technology, leaving me to open the second search result with growing curiosity. It was a formal wedding portrait dated 1902, featuring a stiffly posed bride and groom standing before a painted canvas backdrop of an idealized European garden. The bride was a young, dark-haired woman clutching a bouquet of wilted, drooping flowers, but it was the groom who made the breath catch in my throat. It was my father. He bore the exact same face, the same relaxed stance, the same crooked left earlobe, and an identical dark suit, appearing as though someone had physically cut him out of the 1887 photograph and pasted him seamlessly into this new scene 35 years later. The young bride standing beside him looked faintly terrified, her eyes wide with an unspoken panic and her mouth drawn into a tight, bloodless hyphen, and though I tried to rationalize her expression as a common artifact of early photography, a cold, crawling sensation began to spread across my skin. Driven by a sudden, consuming anxiety, I abandoned all other responsibilities and spent the next 3 days barricaded in my apartment, doing nothing but feverishly tracing my paternal line through digitized census records, obscure obituaries, and rural church registries. I discovered that my great-grandfather, a man listed as Silas, had reportedly died in a tragic farming accident in the spring of 1943, leaving behind his wife, my great-grandmother Eleanor. Before Silas's death, the family had commissioned a formal portrait in the autumn of 1941, And when I finally located a scanned copy of the print in a municipal archive, the floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. There he was again, my father, his arm wrapped possessively tight around Eleanor's shoulders. The devastating detail was that Eleanor was visibly weeping in the photograph. The high-resolution scan clearly captured the wet tracks of tears cutting through her powdered cheeks, the dark smudges of ruined mascara, and the rigid, unnatural way her body leaned away from his embrace. Standing rigidly beside her was a little boy, my grandfather, staring directly into the camera lens with the hollow, exhausted eyes of a child who had endured far too much darkness. The sheer impossibility of the evidence lay spread across my kitchen table. The man lounging outside the 1887 General Store, the solemn groom in the 1902 wedding, and the controlling patriarch in the 1941 portrait. 3 entirely different dates spanning 54 years, 3 separate family units, 3 different names scrawled on the backs of the prints, yet they all shared the exact same unaging face of my father, watching the camera with that faint, patient, emotionless smile. My hands trembled violently as I sifted through the printouts, desperately trying to construct a logical narrative involving an elaborate multi-generational prank, or a bizarre family tradition of naming identical clones after their predecessors. Yet no rational theory could account for a man surviving over half a century without a single gray hair or a deepening wrinkle, nor could it explain the palpable, suffocating terror radiating from the bride's wide eyes, my great-grandmother's desperate tears, or the grim, hardened mouth of a grandfather who should have been too young to understand fear. I forced myself to truly think about my father, examining my memories of him through this terrifying new lens. His pale, almost translucent skin that never tanned. His obsessive preference for heavy blackout curtains, dimly lit rooms, and evening activities. The way he had consistently manufactured excuses to miss my afternoon soccer games unless they were scheduled after dusk. For 31 years, I had accepted his explanation that he suffered from a rare, severe photosensitivity condition that made his skin burn easily, never once questioning the peculiar isolation it required. As the horrifying realization settled over me, I realized that in all my years of living under his roof and visiting his home, I had never actually seen my father stand in direct, unfiltered sunlight. Calling in sick to work with a voice that shook with suppressed panic, I grabbed the manila folder containing the printouts and drove directly to the house where I had grown up. It was a tired mid-century ranch-style home situated on the quiet edge of town, surrounded by a deeply overgrown backyard and illuminated by a dull yellow porch light that he insisted on leaving burning day and night. Using my old brass key, I let myself into the heavy, stagnant air of the front hallway and found him exactly where he always was, sitting in his plush armchair in the living room, a piece of furniture positioned meticulously outside the angle of any window light, watching a black-and-white classic film on the television. He looked up as I entered, offering that same patient, unchanging smile, and casually remarked that he hadn't expected me to visit today, asking with a mild, conversational tone if everything was all right. I refused to step further into the room, standing rigidly in the doorway while clutching the manila folder against my chest like a fragile suit of armor. My voice sounded thin and reedy to my own ears as I announced that I had found some old family photographs and asked if he would look at them. He agreed with a placid nod, and when I handed him the open folder, I watched his face intently for a flinch, a gasp, or a flicker of recognition as his eyes swept over the 1887 portrait, the 1902 wedding, and the 1941 family picture. His expression remained an absolute, terrifying mask of calm. The faint smile never wavered as he closed the folder, set it gently on the wooden side table, and smoothly remarked that family resemblance was certainly a funny, unpredictable thing. "Dad, it's not a resemblance," I whispered, the trembling in my voice betraying my mounting terror. "It's you. It's exactly you. The same face, the same earlobe, the same everything. How is that physically possible?" He folded his pale hands neatly in his lap, the atmosphere in the living room suddenly dropping 10 degrees, and repeated his familiar mantra that we were just plain people with nothing worth digging up. When I demanded to know who he truly was, he tilted his head, studying me with a complex expression that hovered chillingly between paternal affection and cold, calculating pity, answering simply that he was my father. I pointed a shaking finger toward the folder on the table, my voice rising in volume as I shouted that my great-grandmother was crying in that photograph, that she was visibly terrified of him, and I demanded to know what he had done to her to cause such despair. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the house, the old floorboards creaking, settling under the weight of the revelation, while outside the window, a thick cloud passed over the sun, plunging the living room into an even deeper, shadowy gloom. "Eleanor was a remarkably good woman," he finally said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real grief. "She figured it out, too, near the end. She tried to pack a bag, take your grandfather, and leave in the middle of the night. But I couldn't allow that to happen. A growing boy needs his father to guide him." The floor seemed to tilt violently beneath my feet as the implications of his words struck me. He wasn't my grandfather's father, and he wasn't my biological father in any natural sense, leaving me stammering a broken, incomplete sentence as my mind refused to articulate what he truly was. He didn't offer a dramatic confession, but simply explained in a quiet, measured tone that in every generation, he selected one child to carry the name forward, to maintain the family line, and to serve as his anchor in the world. He looked at me with those ancient, tired eyes, his next words striking my heart like a physical blow. He calmly revealed that my mother had also begun to suspect the truth, that her questions had brought her dangerously close to uncovering his nature, and that her curiosity was the reason she had to be removed from the picture. The ringing in my ears escalated into a high, thin whine as I breathed out the realization that the fatal car accident that took her life 15 years ago had not been a tragedy of wet roads, but an execution orchestrated by his hand. He didn't nod or offer a verbal confirmation. His silence and that soft, sad, utterly inhuman smile were all the confession required. He stood up slowly from his armchair, raising his hands in a placating gesture, and swore in a soothing, hypnotic voice that he would never hurt me, declaring that I was his daughter, the singular vessel he had been waiting for to continue the line, and that after taking care of this family for over a century, it was finally my turn to inherit the legacy. I bolted. The survival instinct overrode my paralysis, sending me scrambling backward down the hallway toward the front door, my hands fumbling frantically with the heavy brass deadbolt while my breath tore through my throat in raw, panicked gasps. I threw the heavy door open and staggered out onto the wooden porch, bursting from the shadowed house into the brilliant, golden warmth of the late afternoon sun, feeling the light hit my skin like a physical shield of safety. When I turned back toward the house, my father was standing completely still in the open doorway, the shadow cast by the porch roof falling across his face like a sharp, impenetrable curtain. He made no move to cross the threshold into the light, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his patient smile fixed in place as he calmly warned me that I couldn't stay in the sun forever, and that he possessed nothing but time. I sprinted to my car, locked the doors, and drove blindly until the fuel gauge forced me to stop at a cheap, roadside motel 60 miles away from the town limits. I am writing this account sitting on a stained bedspread with the curtains pulled wide open, letting the harsh, bleaching light of the desert sun flood the room, absolutely terrified to close my eyes. I know I cannot go to the police. No rational detective would entertain a hysterical report claiming that an immortal, shadow-dwelling entity has been systematically breeding and pruning a family line for over a century, and attempting to explain the photographs would only end with me locked in a psychiatric ward. But the true source of my paralyzing fear, the detail that keeps my heart racing and my hands shaking over the keyboard, is not the confrontation in the living room, but a tiny detail I noticed in the background of the 1941 portrait before I fled. Standing just behind the weeping Eleanor and the hollow-eyed grandfather, barely visible in the dark, grainy shadows of the room, is another face peering around the edge of a doorframe. It is a little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, possessing my grandmother's dark eyes, my mother's distinct chin, and the exact same uniquely crooked left earlobe that I see every single morning when I look in my bathroom mirror. I was present in that photograph decades before I was ever physically born, a chilling testament that he has been cultivating my existence and waiting for me my entire life. And as the afternoon light begins to slowly fade from the motel parking lot, I am forced to accept the terrifying truth of his final words. I cannot stay in the sun forever. The sun always sets, and when the last rays of light vanish over the horizon, he will be waiting in the shadows, because he is my father, and a father never truly leaves his daughter behind.